Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 3, Halacha 4, in the Art Scroll 30b1. Now, we were talking before about the laws of separations between a field of vegetables and a row of a different species of vegetables. And we also learned before, what about separating between melons and also grain or other types of vegetables? And we saw that the Tanakama said that you have to have a very large setback. There was a maloket whether it's going to be 8 amos or it's going to be 12 amos. This actually gets clarified here about how far the setback needs to be. And we saw before, just out of talking about this, that the separation for fields of grain has to be 10.5 amos. So in some of these cases, the melons are going to need a bigger setback than even grain. So we got into before in chapter 1 about the Egyptian beans and about the types of gourds like the chait melons and the gourds. And it's going to come back here. Why? Because these melons are particularly leafy and they sort of really entangle other things and they really spread out. They have vines that spread out. So the question is going to be, what happens if you're planting all of these together? How is this going to work for Kilayim? The Mishnah says, if one plants 2 rows of chait melons, 2 rows of gourds, and 2 rows of Egyptian beans, this is permitted. But if one plants 1 row of chait melons, 1 row of gourds, and 1 row of Egyptian beans, this is prohibited. Now, in the conversation that the Bavli has about this, the reason that it's going to allow the double row over in the Bavli is the double row is going to stand out as a distinct entity. And yes, okay, the leaves can entangle over a furrow separation, but according to the Bavli understanding about this, planting side by side even 2 single rows of these species is going to show that you had an intention to plant these, and it's not going to be Kilayim. But the Yerushalmi is not going to understand it this way. The Yerushalmi is going to understand it as what the Gemara is going to be saying, and it's going to be saying that it would be permissible to plant side by side for these 2 rows, and provided that they're separated and they're not closed in. The hang-up that the Yerushalmi has is that it can't appear to be closed in. And if it appears to be closed in, that's going to be a problem. In other words, when you have this closing in issue, it's going to be the middle vegetable that's going to be the problem. The outer ones are not going to be the problem. And it's going to be where, vegetables other than, these species whose leaves don't extend so far could be planted on the two sides. But when you're planting all of these 3 types together, then anything you have in the middle is going to be a problem. And even if you have some other kind of vegetable in the middle, that's also going to be a problem. And so they're basically going to be saying, well, what if you're planting something else on the outside row? Is that going to be an issue? The key always in the Yerushalmi is going to be, well, is it going to look like it's closing in or not? And, in both of the cases of the Mishnah, and I didn't read the second one yet. Well, I did. It's the one plants 1 row of chait melons, 1 row of gourds, and 1 row of Egyptian beans, and this is prohibited. And the idea is that in both of these cases, the chait melons and the Egyptian beans are going to be flanked by the gourds. So the flanking has the potential to prohibit the middle part, that's going to be the gourds, but only if it looks like it's closed in. And in the Mishnah's first case, where the 2 rows are going to together make up this area of 8 amos wide, then the gourds are not going to be closed in. It's going to be permitted. Why? Because we have a setback that's going to be significantly far. So the problem of closing in exists only where vegetables are planted on the 2 sides of the middle. This is going to be because only the species with these leaves that grow very extensively and these vines that grow very extensively, and these kinds of species, if they were planted on both sides of a single row, could close in a middle species and prohibit it. The Bavli case is going to be that, look, it's not going to be a closing in issue like the Yerushalmi is worried about. It's going to be more that the double rows are going to stand out as distinct entities, even though the leaves are going to be very big. There's a third case. It says if one plants one row of chait melons, one row of gourds, and one row of Egyptian beans, and one final row of chait melons, Rabbi Eliezer permits it, but the sages prohibit it. And both Rabbi Eliezer and the sages are going to agree that the other two rows of chait melons cannot close in and prohibit the two middle row of gourds and the Egyptian beans. And this is because together the middle two rows are 8 amos wide. The sages are going to be permitting the middle two rows because they're going to view the 4 rows as overlapping sets of 3 rows each. One set starts from one side of the field and consists of a row of chait melons, a row of gourds, and a row of Egyptian beans. And the other set starts from the opposite side, and thus the row of gourds is going to be closed in by a row of chait melons and a row of beans. And then the row of Egyptian beans is going to be closed in by a row of chait melons. Again, this is all coming back to the middle thing getting closed off and appearing to be surrounded. And that's going to be the issue, this idea of being closed in. It's going to be an issue where it's going to look like it's Kilayim because you've surrounded it and mixed it up. And it's particularly bad when you have these viney plants that have tendrils with large leaves. Now, the Mishnah is going to talk about a technique for separation that's going to permit 2 different species to be grown in close proximity. The Mishnah says a person may plant a chait melon and a gourd in the same hole, provided this plant leads to this side and this plant leans to that side, and the hair, in other words, the foliage of the plant leans to here, and this plant leans to there. And this technique, says the Mishnah, for what the sages prohibited, they decreed only because of appearances. The idea is that this prohibition is going to be rabbinic, and the rabbis forbade only cases that give the appearance of wrongdoing. So training plants in opposite directions is going to remove this appearance of illegally mixed planting, and this technique is therefore permitted by the rabbis. So that's how you could do it. In other words, you can have a single hole, you can plant 2 things in the hole, melons, but the trick is that you have to train them going to different sides, not only the vines, but also the leaves. The Gemara is going to get into the first part of the Mishnah and says if one plants 2 rows of chait melons, 2 rows of gourds, and 2 rows of Egyptian beans, this is permitted. And the above law is assuming that a distance of 8 amos between the 2 outer rows is going to suffice to prevent them from closing in and prohibiting this inner row. And the Gemara is going to discuss whether this separation is actually going to be universally accepted. In other words, when you're planting these rows, there are big setbacks. In other words, this setback is already going to be 8 amos. And Hizkiah in this Gemara said that the law of our Mishnah is subject to dispute. And the one who says in the Mishnah that a spacing of 12 amos is required will say here too that a spacing of 12 amos is required. However, the one who says that a spacing of 8 amos is enough will say here that the spacing of 8 amos is enough. In other words, the Mishnah, which requires a spacing of only 8 amos, must follow this latter opinion. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is going to clarify that. Rabbi Yochanan says that our Mishnah, which requires only 8 amos of gourds between the chait melons and Egyptian beans, follows all opinions, and even the one that requires 12 amos of onions between the patches of gourds. So basically what it's saying is, the Gemara says the power of the melon-like vegetable amid a melon-like vegetable is superior in its ability to save itself from becoming prohibited with only 8 amos of separation. But basically the power of being among other non-melon-like vegetables or gourd-like vegetables is not going to be enough, and you're going to need a 12 amos separation. So the rule is going to be like this. When you're planting all of these rows, you have to have an 8 amos separation between all of this. And if you're going to be putting an outside row of onions, between the melons and the onions, you have to have 12 amos separation between this and that. Now, to save this inner row from becoming closed in, you have to have a certain minimum distance between the outer rows, and the Gemara now is going to discuss what this minimum distance is, And the Gemara says, at what length do the outer rows close in the middle rows? So again, this is going to be like chapter 3, Halacha 3, where we have to have a certain length of how long this row is going to be. It has to be deemed to be significant. Rabbi Zera says in his Gemara, let us learn from the laws of Kilayim of the Vineyard. And just as you say regarding Kilayim of the Vineyard that there is no difference and its length and distance is the same, so too here, our case regarding Kilayim of seeds, there's no difference with its length and distance being the same. In other words, what this is saying is that the minimum length of the outer row, in order to be regarded as not being closed in, has to be equal to the minimum length distance between them in order to be separated. So if you have a distance between this melon plant and that Egyptian bean of being 8 amos, then that 8 amos distance also has to be the minimum length for that row. That's what it's saying. So the Gemara is saying, according to the opinion of Hiskia, it's straightforward what the minimum length of the outer row is. And the one who says over there, in regard to the distance between the outer row, that it is 12 amos, will say here too, in regard to the minimum length of the outer row, it's also 12 amos. And the one who says over there that the outer row is going to be 8 amos, will also say here the minimum length of the outer row, like the separation, has to be 8 amos. So the rule here is that the distance of the separation is also going to have to be the minimum length of the row. So if you have an inner row of melons and an outer row of onions, and like we learned over there, that separation has to be 12 amos. So that means that your row of melons has to be at least 12 amos long as well. This is going to give a visual appearance of not being closed in, and it's also going to give a visual appearance that it's distinctive. It's a distinctive field and it's significant. So the Gemara is going to look at Rabbi Yochanan's position on this minimum length of the outer rows. And again, if you're planting these chait melons next to these beans, next to these gourds, that's going to be separations of 8 amos, because the power of the melon plant is going to be regarded as different and 8 amos. So according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, at what length do the outer rows close in a middle vegetable? And the Gemara says, if you'll say that in the case of a melon-like plant, mid-melon-like plants, that the outer rows are going to be merely 8 amos long in the inner vegetable, then it follows by Kal V'Homer in the case of a melon-like plant introduced among onions, that the outer row is going to be merely 8 amos long, and it's going to close in the middle vegetable. Now, the Gemara is going to explain this. It says, if a melon-like plant amid melon-like plants, which you would have treated leniently, and these outer rows are 8 amos apart to save it, you have treated stringently and allowed outer rows that are going to be 8 amos long and close it in. So the Gemara wants to explain Rabbi Yochanan's Kal V'Chomer. It's going to go like this in this Gemara. It's going to say, if a melon-like plant amid a melon-like plant, which you have treated leniently and allowed outer rows 8 amos apart to save, and you've treated stringently and have allowed outer rows 8 amos long to close in, then a melon-like plant introduced amid onions, which you've treated stringently and allowed outer rows of 12 amos apart to save, should you not certainly treat it stringently and allow the outer row 8 amos long to close in? So, in other words, the question that's being posed over here is that if you had a melon-like plant amid a melon-like plant, that's going to be treated leniently, and only does it become strict when you're planting other kinds of vegetables. And in our Mishnah's case, a distance of only 8 amos between the outer rows is going to prevent the inner rows from being closed in for these melons and beans. Our Mishnah's case is going to be, in a way, treated stringently in that the outer rows are only going to be 8 amos to close in the outer rows. This is going to provide a difficulty because in the case of a melon-like plant amid onions, the distance of 12 amos between the outer row is going to be required to prevent the inner row from being closed in. The outer row of only 8 amos long is going to be enough to close in the inner rows. And this is going to contradict this principle derived from the laws of Kilayim of the Vineyard, namely that the distance that prevents outer rows from being closed in on inner rows is going to be the same length. There's basically pointing out a difference. Normally, you'd say that for the laws of a vineyard, that the separation, as wide as it is, has to be as long for the row. And over here, in the case of a melon, or melons planted next to onions, that's not necessarily the case. The Gemara is going to attempt to reason from a different way, and it's going to show the same problem. And the Gemara says, and if you'll say in the case of a melon-like plant amid onions that the inner vegetable is not closed in except by the outer rows 12 amos long, then it follows by kal v'chomer in a case of a melon-like plant amid a melon-like plant that the inner vegetable will not be closed in except by the outer row 12 amos long, although a distance of only 12 amos between the outer rows prevents the inner rows from being closed in. So there's another question regarding the circumstances on which the outer rows can close in the inner rows. Now, I just want to point out that this kal v'chomer is going to follow the same pattern as the opposite kal v'chomer that we just did, and it's going to be talking about, the melon-like vegetables introduced among onions as being treated more stringently than what the Mishnah is talking about, where you're having melon-like vegetables among melon-like vegetables. In the Mishnah's case with the onions, you're going to need 12 amos between the outer rows to prevent the inner rows from being closed in. But where you're seeing only the melons, you have an 8 amos distance required. Despite this, the Mishnah's case below is treated leniently, that the outer rows are going to be 12 amos long, and that's going to be needed to save the inner rows. In a way, the Mishnah's case is being presented to be lenient. So the Vilna Goan is going to say about this like this. He's going to say, in the case of a melon-like vegetable amid a melon-like vegetable, the distance of only 8 amos between the outer rows is required to prevent the inner rows from being closed in. And the outer rows of 12 amos long, however, are required to close in the inner rows. And this contradicts the principle derived from the laws of Kalim of the Vineyard, namely that the distance that prevents outer rows from closing in the inner rows is going to be the same as the length. So in other words, in the case of the vineyard, the distance of separation between this and that is going to have to be the minimum length of how long the vineyard's going to be. But that's not going to be the case over here. And the Gemara is not going to resolve the question whether, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the outer rows of 8 amos is going to be enough to close in the inner rows, or whether it's going to be 12 amos. So you could have a potential thing where you have a separation between the types of gourds, melons, and beans in the Mishnah, and the separation is going to be 8 amos as a leniency, but the length of the field might be 12 amos. And that's what they're grappling with. It might not be 8 amos. In other words, the distance as a leniency is being given at 8 amos for distance to separate it, but the length of the row might not be at 8 amos. It might be at 12 amos. So there's another, and it's unclear why that should be, by the way. It's just unclear. Now, the Gemara is going to give another set of circumstances under which outer rows can close in inner rows. And the Gemara says, thus far we discussed where one plants the stalks of the outer rows densely, and dense outer rows can certainly close in inner rows. So what is the law where one plants the stalks of the outer rows sparsely? Are those rows going to close in the inner rows? And the Gemara is going to try to resolve this inquiry by drawing a comparison to a vineyard. The Gemara says, just as you say regarding a vineyard that there is no difference, and that the law for where one plants the vine stalks densely applies as well to where he plants the stalks sparsely, so too here there's no difference in the law for where one plants the outer stalks densely applies where he also plants it sparsely. In other words, let's say you're not packing the rows as densely as you can, and you're packing it in sparsely. Basically what this is saying is that you can still count it as closing in an inner row, even though it's not packed in. So the idea is that when somebody's walking by, they're going to see that there's a row planted here. Yes, it may not be fully planted, it might be sparse, but it's still going to be enough that if you don't have the separations needed or the length of the rows needed, it can be enough where it counts as closing it in. That's a big hiddush, and even sparsely planted rows will close in inner rows of vegetables. Now the Mishnah gets to the next thing where it says 1 row of chait melons, 1 row of gourds, and Rabbi Lazar permits it. So the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Yanai says that the Mishnah's ruling in the second case is in dispute, and it is the subject to a disagreement between Rabbi Lazar and the sages recorded in the Mishnah's third case. And in the Mishnah's third case, Rabbi Lazar permits the middle 2 rows of the Egyptian bean and the gourds because he holds that the 2 different species can combine to save themselves. And because 2 different species do not combine to prohibit a third species, now the idea is that the principle that 2 species cannot combine to prohibit a third species is going to apply to the Mishnah's second case as well. And so therefore Rabbi Lazar is going to be disputing the sages in this third case. So the Mishnah talks about 3 cases in total. In the first case, there are going to be 6 rows, two outer rows of chait melons, 2 middle rows of gourds, and 2 outer rows of Egyptian beans. In the second case, there's only 3 rows. That's going to be 1 outer row of chait melons, 1 middle row of gourds, and 1 outer row of Egyptian beans. And in the third case, now there's 4 rows. You have 1 outer row of chait melons, 2 middle rows, 1 row of gourds, 1 row of Egyptian beans, and then the last row is going to be chait melons. Now, in this last case, the Mishnah cited a dispute between Rabbi Lazar and the sages. And Rabbi Lazar is going to permit the middle 2 rows of the gourds and the Egyptian beans, while the sages are going to prohibit it. They're going to say that it's getting closed in. And the Gemara is going to discuss whether this dispute applies to the Mishnah's second case. What's going to be the Mishnah's second case? Well, in the Mishnah's third case, there are 2 possible explanations for the sage's opinion. The first is to say that the sages regard the 2 inner rows collectively to be closed in. And then the idea is that the sage's logic is that they prohibit each of the inner rows individually. And the row of gourds is going to be because it's closed in by a flanking row of chait melons and Egyptian beans, and the row of Egyptian beans because it's closed in by a flanking row of chait melons and gourds. And the Gemara is now going to recount the different explanations to why Rabbi Lazar disagrees with the sage's logic. So basically getting into this, in the middle 2 rows where you have these 4 rows, each of these are going to be 4 amos wide. And they're going to combine to separate the outer rows by 8 amos, but such a large distance in between the outer rows is going to prevent the inner rows from being closed in. And that according to Rabbi Lazar, is going to be enough to save them. And the Chazan Ish is going to explain that the Gemara's language that's going to be coming up, the 2 species combined to save, is imprecise. Because even if 4 of the middle 8 are planted with 1 species and the other 4 are left barren, the arrangement would still be permissible. So the Gemara says like this. Rabbi Yanai says the Mishnah's ruling in the second case is in dispute, and it is subject to the disagreement between Rabbi Lazar and the sages recorded in the Mishnah's third case. And in the Mishnah's second case, Rabbi Lazar permits the middle 2 rows of the gourds and Egyptian beans because he holds the 2 different species combine to save themselves, and because 2 different species do not combine to prohibit a third species. So the idea is that the principle that 2 species cannot combine to prohibit a third species is going to apply to the Mishnah's second case as well. But there's a different opinion. Rav says the Mishnah's ruling in the second case, by the way, what is the second case? So again, the first case is that there are 6 rows. The second case is that there are 3 rows. The 3 rows that you have 1 outer row of chait melons, 1 middle row of gourds, and 1 outer row of Egyptian beans. So the Rav says the Mishnah's ruling in the second case is unanimously held. Everybody agrees with that. And just as Rabbi Lazar holds the 2 species combined to save themselves, so too he holds that the 2 species combine to prohibit a third species. Now, the Gemara is going to, so basically according to Rav, says the Chazan Ish, Rabbi Lazar agrees with the sages that two species can combine to prohibit a third species. And Rabbi Lazar is going to disagree with the sages in the Mishnah's third case, because in the third case, the row of Egyptian beans can become prohibited. And basically, again, what's the third case? Third case is where you have 4 rows, okay? And the Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Yanai's position. And it says that our Mishnah disputes Rabbi Yanai, for we learned in the third case of the Mishnah, Rabbi Lazar permits it. And the fact that the Mishnah quotes Rabbi Lazar's lenient opinion in only the third case, but not the second, is implying that Rabbi Lazar does not argue with the sages in the second case. They only are disagreeing in this third case. So the Gemara is going to challenge Rav's opinion now. It says that our Mishnah disputes Rav, that if one plants 1 row of chait melons, 1 row of gourds, 1 row of Egyptian beans, and a final row of chait melons, that Rabbi Lazar is going to permit this arrangement. Again, there are 4 rows here. So the question is, how can Rabbi Lazar permit it? And it says, why? Before he planted the 4th row, were not the rows already prohibited? So, in other words, as soon as he planted the first 3 rows, the middle row of gourds became closed in and created a Kilayim situation. So basically what it's saying is unreasonable to say that the rows are going to now return to become prohibited after a 4th row gets planted. But the Gemara is going to deflect this, and it's going to say, interpret the Mishnah as referring to where he planted all 4 of them at the same time. And in other words, that they didn't plant 3 and then do a 4th row, according to Rabbi Lazar's position, to make it permitted. Basically, they were doing it all at the same time. And, he planted it on the same day, and they all took root on the same day. And the idea, says the Chazan Ish about this, is that if a person sows an arrangement that should be considered Kilayim, if he plans on nullifying the Kilayim before the seeds take root, his planting is going to be permitted, and as long as he's still engaged in the process of planting. So this is a technicality on how this could possibly be. And again, the Tanna Kama don't agree with it. Basically, Rabbi Lazar is playing with this idea about when seeds are being planted. So if somehow this row, like you magically came about this row and they were already there, it would be forbidden. But what Rabbi Lazar is playing with is that before the seeds take root, this planting is permitted. And so as long as he's still in the process of planting, this is still permitted. That's the case that he's talking about. So the Gemara now is going to move on to, and again, that's not the Halacha, not the Halacha L'maisa, and the Tanna Kama don't agree with it. That, in other words, that this is a commentary that you've planted something that will be Kilayim, and the Tanna Kama have a problem with that. That's what this third case is talking about. This third case is really a commentary on if you've been planting something and it wasn't planted right, and it's planted in a way that will be Kilayim when it grows, is it going to be Kilayim? The sages are saying yes. So the next case, a person may plant a chait melon and a gourd in the same hole, provided that the plant leads to this side and the plant leads to that side, and we'll be finishing up. And the Gemara says that it was taught in a brisa that a person is permitted to make in his field a small hole a tefach deep and plant in it 4 different types of seed and angle them toward the 4 sides. And the Gemara qualifies the permit. Rabbi Abba Bar Kana cited Shimon of Narash, who said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that they taught this permit only where the plants lead toward an unplanted area. In other words, it has to go to an area where there's no other vegetables within the minimum space required to have a separation between different fields of vegetables. And if they did have plants growing next to the rim of the hole, this is not permitted to train the plants over there. They're only talking about a theoretical case where you're in the middle of nowhere. The Gemara is going to object to this, and Rabbi Mana asks and says, if the cases where they lean toward an unplanted area, let the brisa teach that one can plant 8 different types of seed in a single hole, because he can angle 2 here, 2 there, 2 here, 2 there toward each side. And basically 4 species can be trained to the 4 points of the compass.
and 4 more toward the corners of the compass. And basically, if an area around the hole is not barren, then it's understandable that the Bryce is going to limit the number of species in the hole to 4, because the species planted in the hole would have been trained toward the 4 corners of the hole, and that would avoid appearing to be intermingled with plants growing on the sides of the hole. So Rabbi Manna's question assumes that it's not necessary for the different species to be trained at a 90-degree angle. Rather, a 45-degree angle is going to be enough. So tomorrow we're going to be getting into what's going to happen when you're trying to plant along, gourds with onions, because that, how much gap do you need? How much separation do you need? So, basically you're trying to plant melons and gourds next to other things on your farm. And as we're seeing, melons and gourds and Egyptian beans, which are vines, are going to have special distancing and special cases where, you might have the appearance of closing in the interspecies, and that's a problem. Have a great day.